Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the House Appropriations Committee, Transportation and Environment Subcommittee. I'm sorry we're starting a couple minutes late. We have 3 agencies to go over this afternoon: the Maryland Energy Administration, the Department of Transportation Motor Vehicle Administration, and the Department of Transportation Transit Administration. We will start with the Energy Administration. Our analyst is Samuel Quist, and while he's going through the presentation, please feel free, Mr. Director, welcome to the House, and feel free to come on up to the table with your team as we hear from Mr. Quist.
Thank you, Delegate Corman and members of the subcommittee. This is the DLS analysis of the budget for the Maryland Energy Administration. The FY 2024 allowance totals $167.5 million, which is an increase of about $33.6 million from the 2023 working appropriation. This increase is primarily due to increased revenues from the Strategic Energy Investment Fund that are available. I'm going to turn ahead in the document, in the interest of time, to page number 10, which is discussing the fiscal 2023 budget amendment that was processed. I'd like to point out that in both FY 2022 and FY 2023, there were sizable budget amendments processed mid-year to increase the appropriation to allocate additional CEF fund revenue that was available. In FY 2022, the appropriation increased by $28.6 million through this budget amendment. In FY 2023, the budget amendment that was processed was $58.9 million. And on page 10 of the analysis, there's a breakdown of the spending where that was accounted for. The other item for FY23 that I'd like to point out is that in last year's budget bill, the General Assembly restricted funding from the state's revenue stabilization account for a variety of legislative priorities. Within MEA, approximately $3.8 million was restricted for a grant to the Maryland Clean Energy Center for a funding for the Climate Catalytic Capital Fund, which was mandated by Chapter 38 or the Climate Solutions Now Act of last year. In January, the governor released these funds, which were allocated, but due to the timing of that, they're not currently reflected in this budget data document. Chapter 38 also created a mandated appropriation for FY 24 through 26 of $5 million. In FY 24, those funds are budgeted outside of MEA. They're included in the budget for the University of Maryland College Park. I'd also point out that these funds for MCEC are separate from the annual $2.1 million required transfer from the CEF that they receive along with the Maryland Energy Innovation Institute at University of Maryland College Park. Exhibit number 5 of the document is the overview of the FY24 spending. There's a few different categories being reflected on this chart, so I'll start out with the largest portion of the budget, renewable and clean energy programs and initiatives. In FY24, they total about $103.4 million, or 62% of the overall budget. In Exhibit 5, we have these broken down in a few components, the largest being solar energy programs, which are about $30.1 million, $10.9 million for transportation-related programs, and $9.3 million for the Maryland Energy Infrastructure Program. And then there are also the $53.2 million for various other renewable energy and clean energy programs and initiatives. The other, about third of the budget, is for energy efficiency programs. Low and moderate income energy efficiency programs total approximately $20 million, and energy efficiency programs in other sectors total about $31.6 million. The remainder of the budget covers both the operating expenses for MEA as well as the revolving loan fund for the Jane E. Lawton Conservation Loan Program. Then turning to page 6 page 13, rather, exhibit number 6 on page 13. This is showing similar, the overview of the FY24 allowance by fund source. So as you can see, the largest source and typically the largest ongoing source for MEA is the CEF sourced from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative participation by the state. These revenues come from the quarterly auctions that are held through the program for the sale of carbon dioxide emissions allowances. In FY24, these revenues total about $94 million, or 56% of the budget. Outside of this source, the next largest, as shown in Exhibit 6, are alternative compliance payments. Altogether, total about $49 million, or 30% of the budget. Alternative compliance payments, or ACPs, as they're referred to, are deposited into the Strategic Energy Investment Fund under the terms of the state's Renewable Portfolio Standard. Generally, this the RPS program requires alternative compliance payments to be deposited when the percentages, basically the percentages for sourcing electricity sales from renewable sources are not met. In previous years, alternative compliance payments budgeted have been minimal. However, starting in the FY23 budget and continuing in the FY24 budget, there's been a notable size increase due to ACP payments, specifically from the solar energy sector. And the analysis goes into that in more detail, basically due to the increased demand for solar renewable energy credits because of changes made by the Clean Energy Jobs Act in 2019, which increased the solar carve-out. The increased demand for those renewable energy credits has caused their price to rise, and due to insufficient availability of those, electric companies have made increasing amounts of alternative compliance payments to make up the difference. The other fund sources included in the budget in Exhibit 6 are largely resulting from Public Service Commission orders, including the Maryland Gas Expansion Fund is the largest of these other sources. There are also broken out on the right-hand side of the chart funding for offshore wind programs from the 2 offshore wind accounts. And then you can see at the bottom, one of the smallest categories, about 1% or $1.6 million, is the federal and reimbursable funding. The entirety of the MEA budget is special funds besides that small amount, which is budgeted under administration. The next section of the analysis, turning to page number 15, Exhibit 7, this is basically highlighting some of those non-regional greenhouse gas initiative sourced revenues, and it's highlighting that besides the ACP payment component of those, the sources resulting from PSC orders are largely one-time in nature. So as funds are spent from those, the balance is generally decreasing. As you can see, the FY24 end-of-year estimate is approaching zero for those sources as funds are spent out of those. Pages 16 and 17 provide more programmatic detail for the changes in the budget. I'm not going to go through each one of these individually, but again, I'd highlight that the overall budget change is $33.6 million. If you look first under the personnel category, there's an increase of about $1.1 million for personnel expenses. This includes the cost for 10 additional positions that are included in the allowance. The other large categories for program funding, there's about $30 million for new programs and initiatives included in the budget. And then by program, the energy efficiency outside of the LMI sector increases by about $15.7 million, and renewable energy programs and initiatives increased by about 13.8 million. One thing specifically that we highlight in the analysis is funding from the Maryland Gas Expansion Fund. There's about 9.3 million budgeted in FY24, which is a decrease of about 9 million from what was included in the allowance in FY23. During the last legislative session, the General Assembly restricted about half of the appropriation from the Maryland Gas Expansion Fund, and the amount that is budgeted in FY24 corresponds to the amount that was restricted and was not released by the governor. And the analysis is asking MEA to comment on the restricted funds in the FY23 budget. Next, on page 18, there is some additional discussion on MEA transportation programs. These total about 10.9 million, 4.6 of which is budgeted for the electric vehicle supply equipment rebate program. There is also funding included in the budget reflecting the mandate for the medium duty and heavy duty zero emission vehicle grant program, which was created through chapters 234 of 2022, the Clean Cars Act. And then on page 19, there's a little bit more detail on the personnel in the agency. As I mentioned in the previous pages, there was 10 additional regular positions. There are also 6 additional contractual FTE positions in MEA, and page 20 of the analysis provides a more detailed breakdown for the different programs which those 10 positions are going towards. The issues section of the analysis begins on page 21. The first issue is further discussion on the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative program and the state's revenues from participation in that. The first thing that I would point out on page 21 is that the analysis notes the current status of Pennsylvania, our neighboring state, in joining that. In April 2022, there were actions taken by the state of Pennsylvania to join as the 12th state. However, there is current ongoing legal action, and although they are technically considered a member now, they have not participated in any of the auctions yet, as those legal challenges continue. Exhibit 9 on page 22 is showing the total dollars of revenue received by the state of Maryland from each of the quarterly auctions held between September 2019 and the most recent in December of 2022. And you can see illustrated on this chart the general increase in overall revenues achieved over the past 2 calendar years. In auction 56, which was held in June of 2022, the auction clearing price reached its highest point at $13.90 for allowance, and since that auction, there have been prices elevated at that amount, ranging between about $12.99 and $13.90. So as a result, that is leading to the increased total revenue shown in Exhibit 9. In FY 2022, the total amount of revenues received by Maryland was about $143 million, which is pretty substantial increase. It's almost double the $77.8 million total received by the state in FY 2022. And across the 2 auctions held over the first half of FY 23 in September and December of last year, Maryland's also received a total of about $74.6 million, indicating that the FY 23 total of revenue received is going to continue to be elevated at a high level. The analysis continues on by discussing a little bit about how MEA uses projections to develop the budget. In prior years, there had been a little bit more variation in the revenues received by the state. So in prior years, MEA had used a floor price estimate for the auctions to estimate revenue for budget purposes in the current fiscal year, and then it would use actual overattainment above that price available for the subsequent budget cycle. Pointing out in the analysis that in FY23, the budget formulation cycle, MEA slightly altered this methodology by increasing the clearing price used for estimation from the floor price to the average price for the two most recent fiscal years. So, for example, in the FY24 budget, there is a $9.94 per allowance price used in estimation compared to the $2.50 floor price that is included. This increase in the price used for estimation for budgetary purposes increases the amount of funds budgeted in the current cycle and reduces the amount of overattainment that is left for budgeting in a future budget cycle. However, the analysis is asking MEA to comment on, due to the fact that the most recent 2 consecutive years, there have been pretty sizable budget amendments allocating fund balance. If this is the budget practice in future years, if this is having an impact on reducing the amount of overattainment and fund balance for future years, or if it's likely that there will continue to be budget amendments mid-year allocating additional fund balance. Exhibit number 10 on page 24 is presenting the revenue distribution to each of the CEF subaccounts as determined by statute. As discussed in the DHS Office of Home Energy Programs earlier this session, about half of the revenue is currently allocated by statute to be distributed to DHS for energy assistance programs, and then 20% is allocated to renewable and clean energy programs within MEA, and 10% is allocated to each of the energy efficiency programs within MEA, and the administration subaccount is limited to 10% or no more than $5 million. Other statutory required distributions shown on pages 24 and 25 include the amount that is required to be transferred for the participation dues in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative program, the $2.1 million annual transfer for the Maryland Clean Energy Center and the Maryland Energy Innovation Institute I mentioned previously. And in FY24, there is $8.25 million required to be transferred to the Transportation Trust Fund, reflecting tax credits under the Zero Emission Vehicle Excise Tax Credit Program as mandated by Chapter 234 of 2022. I would note that in FY23 last year, there were no transfers required for that purpose, but due to Chapter 234 reestablishing the Zero Emission Vehicle Excise Tax Credit, there are now the $8.2 million budgeted for a transfer from the CEF in FY24. Pages 25 also briefly mentioned the required transfers to the Department of Commerce in the Small Minority and Women-Owned Business account of $500,000 in FY24 and $1 million in FY24 for the Department of Labor for the Clean Energy Workforce account. Those two distributions occur out of the Renewable Energy subaccount. Exhibit 26 is showing data from the budget books on the allocation of CEF revenues across all state agencies which receive them, including MEA and others. As you can see, the total allocation across state agencies is about $204.4 million. This is increasing by about $25.2 million, the largest increase being in DHS as well as the energy efficiency sector of MEA. I'm going to turn now to the last update in the analysis, which is a discussion of the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, which were signed into law at the federal level and include some substantial money for both a variety of energy-related purposes and grid infrastructure. Under the IIJA, DBM issued a report in December of 2022 outlining about $34.6 million across 4 programs, which are anticipated to be distributed to the state through MEA. These are shown on pages 28 and 29. Pages 29 and 30 also include some discussion on the funding in the IIJA for electric vehicles. Although the funding itself is administered by MDOT, MEA has been in collaboration regarding the state plan for the use of that funding. And Exhibit 13 on page 30 is showing detail on the amount of electric vehicles registered in Maryland and how it's grown, as well as electric vehicle chargers incentivized by MEA through some of its programs. And then lastly, on page 31, the Inflation Reduction Act. This is discussing 2 of the 2 large home rebate programs implemented by the IRA. In November of 2022, there was funding announced to the state of Maryland by the Department of Energy. However, the current federal guidance for those programs is still ongoing, and as of this month, DOE has not begun to accept applications for that funding yet. It's anticipated that will occur later in the calendar year. At the bottom of page 32, the analysis is asking MEA to comment on the status of funding under both the IIJA and the IRA, and particularly among the more competitive grant programs, what the status of applying for funds available to the state are. There are 4 recommended actions beginning on page 33 that the Department of Legislative Services is making. The first recommendation is to increase the amount budgeted for turnover expectancy for the 10 new positions in FY24 to approximately 25% to be consistent with budgeted turnover for new positions. The second recommendation is similar reporting as in prior years related to the CEF fund accounting by DBM in the budget books. The third recommendation is narrative, providing an update on the Maryland Gas Expansion Fund and activities in fiscal 2024 and 23. And the fourth recommendation is committee narrative regarding the status of the 2 home rebate programs under the IRA. I will conclude there. We can take any questions at this time.
Thank you, Sam. Any questions for the analyst? Great. Thanks again, Sam. We'll now turn to the agency, Director Pinsky, and I guess Assistant Director Wakefield.
Yes.
Director Pinsky, welcome back to the House. I realize you were here, you served here for a little bit.
Yes, 8 years. 8 years. Proud years. Thank you, Mr. Subcommittee Chairman and members of the subcommittee. As you mentioned, I'm here with Jessica Wakeman, who is the Deputy Director for Finance and Administration, and we have a number of staff members from MEA to answer any questions, given that I've been on the job for 6 weeks. So they are still the experts, and I'm learning what I don't know. But let me, if I could, start with some preliminary comments in terms of some context for your deliberations. First, I want to thank Mr. Quist for his comprehensive review of the budget, and let me state for the record that we concur with his recommendations. So let that be clear. I would like to set some context for our budget request before you. Let me mention 3 quick items. One, last year, many of you, I think probably all of you, the General Assembly adopted the Climate Solutions Now Act, which called for a 60% reduction by 2031. So that's a fairly important marker, and it will be a heavy lift but I think that has to be understood in terms of the context of our charge. Secondly, on environmental side, about 2 weeks ago, a report was released from scientists that said the Arctic ice in the Antarctic region was at the lowest since they started measuring it, and that's been over 50 years. That has implications for where things are going in the future. And finally, as Mr. Quist talked about, the federal funds, the IRA and the IIJA, the Infrastructure Bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, will bring some numbers of dollars to the state. We know of some of them which are formula-based, others we don't know yet, and we also don't have a timeline on the IRA. They sent out a request for information, so their timeline and their guidance is still fairly soft, so we can't give you specific understanding if it's going to happen in FY24 or how late in the year for that. So the urgency of our increasing efforts, I think, can be caught up in those 3 points. Last year, we gave approximately $67 million in grants, loans, rebates, and credits. Each of those applications has to be reviewed, approved, and finally tracked on its progress. That takes people power. Funds have increased, as Mr. Quist has raised. The RGGI quarterly auctions have gone up, but we can't be sure what they're going to be each quarter. They vary. So that's why we use the last 8-quarter rolling average to come up with what we think is the best kind of opportunity to figure that out. And additionally, the Alternative Compliance Fund has also gone up. And it went up dramatically last year, and it's hard to tell what that number will be, and we won't know till April. So that adds a little vulnerability to our numbers, which basically necessitates the need for the budget amendments in the spring. And let there be light. I thought it was for the mood. Maybe we're saving energy. Yeah, of course. Of course. I should have expected that. I would also say that our agency has run up against a statutory limitation on administrative expenditures. And I want to note that. We can't spend more than $5 million on administration. And so as the revenue goes up, for us to distribute that money, review applications, track the applications, it takes people to do that. But we've been limited in our ability to spend more because it's in the statute, which is fairly unique. So we've been capped, and it has allowed us for 41 positions. And as you'll see, there are 16 additional positions, 10 PINs and 6 contractual. And in the governor's bill, which I think is being heard in the House today, his transportation bill, he lists that cap on administrative costs. So if that bill passes, and if the budget retains those 16 positions, we'll be in much better shape to distribute, analyze that additional funds, those additional funds coming in from both ACP and from RGGI. To better ensure that grant applicants are being used in the most effective way, we also are instituting some new reforms. We're putting in 2 new tools, 2 new metrics, if you will. One is to try to better understand when someone puts in a grant for clean energy or energy efficiency, that we have an understanding of what is the bang for the buck, how much greenhouse gas will be reduced per dollar. We haven't used that in the past, or it hasn't been used by the prior administration, and we want to formalize it to have apples to apples. You know, because the 60% reduction goal is so difficult, we have to be very intentional about our investments. So we are working on developing the metric so we can look at every project in terms of what the reduction will be for each dollar spent. So we want to quantify our decisions. And that won't be the only criteria, but we think it's one that's been missing and very important. Additionally, we had, I think, approximately 250 applicants last year for our loans, rebates, whatever. And I think about 200 were approved. We believe there are some entities out there that might have great projects that might really show a great reduction in greenhouse gas per dollar. So we might, in fact, go out to beat the bushes and encourage even more applicants. Because if they get a better return on investment, it might have to squeeze out some of the ones that have come in the past. So that actually is going to add some also additional work to us. The second item, and I'll finish up, Mr. Chairman, is what's called Justice 40, for those communities that have been disproportionately affected. We want to give a greater focus on Justice 40, and that's to low and moderate income. Unfortunately, a lot of communities have been ignored, either consciously or unconsciously, and we have to ensure that the benefits of our investment go to those communities as well. That's why a lot, on the federal level, they talk about 40%, well, of the benefits, not necessarily of the financial investment. A lot of other agencies are investing money. Human Services, DHS, spends money on energy assistance, as Mr. Quist talked about. DHCD spends money on weatherization. And we spend a fair amount of money, and a large number of our approved applicants go to low and moderate income. But I think we can do better. We also think there are many people who are not served by this. So we've got to figure out a way to bring in other low-income people who don't know about these programs and to better serve them. But that will take a conscious outreach, which may have been lacking in the past. And additionally, as I said, we're going to have new money, which we can't necessarily quantify, from the IRA and the IIJA. We do know there's $136 million in housing. We know that's coming. That's formula-based. But there are a number of competitive grants in the IRA. We're having a conversation with MDE to figure out which projects are in whose lane, to figure out who should apply for what. So we have people working on that currently, and they are not accepting applications yet. It's very early in the process, so we don't know how much that's going to translate to. So to conclude, yes, it's true there are current fund balances, and yes, additional funds may be expected in the near term, but we think we are best suited to expend those funds with targeted investments that reduce greenhouse gases and improve energy efficiency. We have ambitious plans that are thoughtful and intentional, and in our opinion, we would want to work to fulfill those goals of the state. That being said, we are happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you. It's very odd to hear you calling me Mr. Chairman. So, I do have a question. It's a little bit broader than MEA, but I think of your portfolio as a little broader than MEA, which is this ACP issue. Obviously, it generates money for the CEF, and we'll help you spend it. Don't worry about that. But I think that's not really the goal of the bills that, frankly, you and the vice chair, when she was on ECM, did so much to pass. So do you have any thoughts about how we're going to sort of shift away from these being ACP payments and get back to what the purpose was, which was RECs and renewable energy?
That's a great question, Mr. Subcommittee Chairman. In my opinion, and I'll defer to some of my staff, the more solar we can get on the ground, the more it's going to bring the SRECs in play. Right now, they're not in play. In terms of utility scale solar, it's been very minimal, and I won't get into the reasons for that. And obviously, ACP now can go towards low-income solar areas, and I know there's a bill to make community solar permanent, which we support. If we haven't shared that testimony, that's where we'll be on that issue. So we want to build community solar. We want to get more utility and smaller scale solar on the ground, and we think that will have some contributory to bringing the SRECs where they're available, and rather than people just choosing to go to the ACP because it's cheaper for them. I don't know if anybody wants to add anything to that. We good? Okay.
Other questions for MEA? Olga Edelson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great to see you. Congratulations.
Thank you. I think.
A subject that isn't so often discussed is district energy. It's important to me since we have the largest district energy asset in my district. I know that there's been some work with folks in district energy about how we can, continue the decarbonization efforts and expand upon it. I just wanted to get if there's any thoughts or updates you wanted to share on those discussions or efforts to expand district energy and continue decarbonization efforts that way?
I'm going to defer. Who would like to take that? Chris or Jen? This is Chris Rice, Chief of Staff at MEA.
Good afternoon. MEA will work with any district energy system to help decarbonize their energy sources, and we have programs to do that. We have some combined heat and power programs, as well as a few other programs, solar programs that could potentially help decarbonize those sources of energy.
Okay, great. Thank you. Look forward to discussing them with you.
Any further questions? Okay, I do have one more, which relates to the Maryland Gas Expansion Fund. Now, obviously, this is not just MEA, but comes from a PSC settlement, but there's been a tussle between the legislature and the agency for a number of years over the use of these funds, and I would love to hear your thoughts about how we might be able to get past the tussle and maybe use them to address, in a small way, some of those global challenges you were describing at the beginning of your testimony.
Well, I figured that question was coming. We're between the rock and the hard place. The legislature has spoken, and I know you've been very active on this, and the public service has given clear direction. And while in my own personal mind, I might think that the legislature has primacy because of my 30-plus years in the legislature, attorneys say that it might be unconstitutional if we ignore what the PSC directives. And so we're a bit stuck. And there is a $9.3 million sitting out there. I have my own personal bias, which probably people here know, of where we should be spending money and how we move to electrification. But I don't have a great answer for you. And I don't know if my predecessor had a different answer or a better answer. And I understand, and I'm very sympathetic with the view of we shouldn't be spending it to build more infrastructure of an industry that's changing. I think even in the climate solutions bill, there was an aspirational belief near the end of the bill about moving towards electrification. Now there is a whole work group working on that issue, and they're meeting now and working slowly, and I'm very sympathetic to that. But because it is a director from the Public Service Commission, and we think that has primacy over the legislation, that's sort of where we are at the moment.
Yeah, I think the party with a claim is, the one that we maybe need to talk to here, because there's only one party I think that could bring that claim that it's unconstitutional or that something is being deprived of them. So maybe they could be brought to the table in some way. I leave that to you. It's an executive function, but I would just commend that to you as a potential path forward here. Instead of it being a PSC, MEA legislative fight, it's really about that party that was party to the settlement agreement that maybe we could work with on something.
So, Mr. Chairman, so you're suggesting if we can get them to the table and see if they would be willing to clarify, soften, whatever term you want to use, the direction of that settlement and the flexibility or lack thereof might be a way to go.
Well, you know how it is, Chair Emeritus. I'm just throwing bombs from up here in the legislature, but it might be worth having that discussion to see if there's a path forward that, because there is need for investment in our existing natural gas infrastructure that may be attractive. So,
and I would say this, and I don't want to speak for the staff. If it has to be spent in that area, it's going to be spent in areas that clearly are needed and would be needed under any path. So we don't want to just replicate something that doesn't need to be replicated, particularly if the whole industry is changing over the next 10 or 20 years. So I think our view is that if it's an area that can't be served in another way and needs the infrastructure opposed to, I won't say it'll be spent willy-nilly to just replace an existing pipe somewhere. So I think that's our intent if we have to go forward as it is. But I would welcome that suggestion to see if we can even have a broader conversation with the litigant.
Great. We look forward to working with you on it. Thank you so much for being here, to you and your entire team. And with that, colleagues, that concludes the budget hearing on the Maryland Energy Administration. We will now turn to the Maryland Department of Transportation Motor Vehicle Administration. And while Carrie Cook is coming up and reading her testimony, Secretary Riedlfeld, I'm not sure I saw Administrator Neiser, but if she's here, feel free to come to the table while Carrie Cook is giving her presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chair. Again, Carrie Cook with the Department of Legislative Services, presenting the analysis for MDOT Motor Vehicle Administration. So you can see on page 1 here, the fiscal 2024 operating budget increases $7.2 million or 3.2% to $230.4 million. And their PAYGO capital budget on page 2 increases $500,000 or 1.4% to $35.2 million. Some issues that I'm going to cover later in the presentation include proposed and then unproposed changes to the vehicle emissions program, as well as the rollout of mobile virtual driver's licenses. So turning now to the Managing for Results section. So Exhibit 1 on page 4 shows ASD, which is alternate service delivery transactions as a percent of all transactions. So what this is showing here is the proportion of MVA transactions where customers are able to do it in a way other than going to the branch office. So that could be online or through one of their kiosks. Obviously, this is promoting efficiency both for the customer and for the agency staff. So you can see here that the agency is setting very high goals for themselves. Their goal was 72.4% in fiscal 2022. They did exceed that by about 2 percentage points, and they are continuing to increase that goal as they implement efficiencies throughout the agency. Exhibit 2 on page 5 is the average cost per MVA transaction. This is cost to the customer. So in FY22, their goal was $16. They just barely didn't reach it. About $16.16 was the actual value. In fiscal 2023, they are increasing the goal just a little bit there due to increased supply costs due to inflation. They've increased their goal to $17.26 and just barely went over it. And that's just due to unavoidable cost increases due to inflation. But I did want to highlight that they are still well below the average cost to the customer in fiscal 2020, which was over $20 per transaction due to COVID-related increased costs. Exhibit 3 on page 6 shows average customer wait time and total visit times. So this is the time that you are waiting for your transaction when you visit the branch office, and then the total time for the whole period, the wait time plus the time that it takes to go through the transaction. So you can see a decrease in fiscal 2020 and 2021 here. This is due to the appointment-only system that MVA implemented starting during the pandemic. So that did improve efficiencies. Folks had to make appointments, and so they weren't waiting as long. You do see an increase here in fiscal 2022, and that is due to their new Customer Connect system. So this is a system that is promoting efficiencies agency-wide. It's sort of centralizing a lot of the online transactions and things like that. So this is what the agency views as a temporary increase in the amount of wait times just due to staff getting acclimated to this new system. And you can see here that in fiscal 2024 estimated and in 2023, the wait times have already started to come back down to the previous levels. So now turning to the proposed fiscal 2024 allowance on page 7, Exhibit 4. You can see the plurality of the spending here is in driver and vehicle services. So that is MVA branch office operating expenses as well as administration. You can also see the VEEP, which is the emissions program, as well as highway safety and insurance compliance. Exhibit 5 on page 8 and 9 shows the changes in the proposed budget from fiscal 2023. So their personnel expenses increased by a net $3.8 million. Similar to other agencies, they had increased projected costs for employee health insurance, as well as the 4.5% cost of living adjustment. They do have some increased projected costs for operational needs, again, just due to inflation. Things like the actual stickers and tags and photo ID supplies, increase in cost for those. And then finally, on page 9, there are some projected changes regarding the Customer Connect system. So they do have an increase of about 3.4 thousand for the software acquisition and maintenance for the Customer Connect system. However, they are projecting a reduction in costs for those efficiency measures across the agency, digitizing processes, things like that. Turning now to the personnel section, which is on page 10. There is no change in their regular positions. The agency does plan to receive 1/2 of a contractual position, additional position in fiscal 2024. Their vacancy rate did increase by 1.1 percentage points over the previous year. The vacancy rate cited there is 8.5%. I will note that as of February, it has gone down a little bit. They hired a few more positions, so now it's down to 8.2 as of February 1st. Compared to other agencies that are facing high vacancy rates, MVA is actually not doing too bad in terms of vacancies, but they did provide some very helpful and interesting information that I wanted to highlight about their vacancies. So the agency notes that job classifications called customer agent and driver's license agency positions have the highest turnover rates, and it accounts for the vast majority of their PINs. It's about 1,000 of their PINs. So these are public-facing positions, and the agency is facing difficulty in hiring these positions due to the lack of telework flexibility, which is what everyone wants these days. So the agency has been proactive in this approach. They did a study, and they also increased the starting salary for all existing and new positions. The agency does note that the vacancy in these positions specifically is hindering some training and cross-training efforts internally, as well as occasionally requiring customers to reschedule their driver's licenses tests or going to a different branch that is not facing the personnel challenges. So DLS recommends MVA comment on how the salary increase for certain customer-facing positions has impacted recruitment efforts for those positions, and how the new compensation levels compare with similar positions in nearby jurisdictions. So turning now to the PAYGO Capital Program, which starts on page 11. Their 6-year program in the Consolidated Transportation plan is $117 million, which is a decrease of $5.3 million from the previous 6-year program, largely attributed to the conclusion of funding for the ASD Alternate Service Delivery Project in fiscal 2022. So again, that is to promote efficiency in the agency, creating more of those kiosks and things like that. Page 12 shows the capital allowance projects receiving funding in fiscal 2024. So you can see the Customer Connect system, just continued maintenance for all those new software systems, as well as the Glen Burnie headquarters renovation is receiving funding in fiscal 2024. Now turning to the issues section of the analysis, which begins on page 13. So MVA proposed pretty substantial changes to their vehicle emissions program. This has sort of had a extended time period. So initially, the changes were proposed in February 2022. DLS published an analysis in May. There was some back and forth with the AELR committee. AELR decided to place a hold on these regulations in October. In November, the agency expressed its intent to override that hold. AELR did formally oppose the regulations, and then they were final published in January with an effective date of January 23rd and an implementation date of March 1st. So what these regulations did was extend the grace period for new vehicles in requiring emissions tests. So previously, when you purchased a new vehicle, you were not required to have an emissions test for 3 years, and these regulations would have extended that to 6 years. They also made some other changes, including establishing motorist assistance centers. The agency noted the reasoning to get these regulations through as soon as possible had to do with a vendor and a contract that operates this emissions program. So the agency noted that they needed to get the regulations published in order to renew the contract via the RFP. And they also noted that this new contract would allow for potential savings to the state by creating a system where they have a per test fee system, so charging the vendor per test rather than a flat rate, which could potentially save the state some funding. I'm going to go over the fiscal impact and then the latest on this. So on Exhibit 8, which is on page 15, this is projected revenue before and after this regulatory change. So what goes into this is, since the number of vehicles that are being subjected to these required tests is decreasing, that is projected to decrease the revenue because there's less revenue from test fees and late fees as well. So you can see here, fiscal 2023, March 1st was supposed to be the implementation date for the regulation. So there would be a 1.3 million reduction in net revenue for March 1st through the end of fiscal 2023. And then for fiscal 2024, the regulations would be in effect for the entire fiscal year. There would have been a reduction of 3.8 million in revenue. And this is based on several assumptions, including the amount of vehicles that they expected would have qualified, the amount of kiosk tests versus in-office tests, late fees assessed, and things like that. Those are all just based on historical trends. And the latest on this issue is that on February 10th, the agency withdrew the advertised procurement for emissions management and operations. The agency notes they are now reevaluating these regulations to ensure they're in the best interest of the state. So MVA should comment on the future of these regulatory changes, including the reasoning for the policy change following final publish in the Maryland Register. The agency should also be prepared to discuss if a new path forward will be determined by the original March 1st implementation date and when a revised RFP for a contractor to manage the emissions program will be advertised. The second issue that I'm covering here is regarding mobile driver's licenses. So in May 2022, digital driver's licenses became available for Maryland drivers to access on Apple devices. So the benefit for mobile driver's licenses is that instead of presenting a physical ID card that has all of your information on it, when you have a mobile driver's license, there is a digital transaction similar to a touchless pay, where it's pulling only the data required for that specific transaction rather than transferring all of your data. So it is something that can increase privacy for folks and not having to transmit all of their data for every transaction. You also do not need to physically hand over your device. As I said, it's like that touchless pay. Maryland was a leader in this effort. So Maryland was the second state in the country to enable mobile driver's licenses. And they do not replace the original identification issued by MVA. The program is also completely voluntary. So in terms of where you can use your mobile driver's licenses, there are 13 airports around the country, including BWI and Reagan nearby, that are accepting mobile driver's licenses at security checkpoints. Currently, local law enforcement do not accept mobile IDs, but the agency notes that the expansion is pretty rapid, and as the use of the reader technology becomes more universal, it may be able to be applied to more scenarios. As I mentioned, Maryland has been a leader in this effort on mobile driver's licenses, and MVA is now sharing their expertise. They are assisting a national organization in developing best practices for mobile identifications. 13 states have now either implemented or in the process of implementing these types of mobile licenses, and an additional 15 are pursuing the option through legislation or studies. So this is rapidly expanding, and Maryland was a leader in this effort. In terms of the non-iPhone users, MVA is working with Google to offer a beta program which launched in December, and then full rollout of mobile driver licenses on Google devices is expected around June. The final issue here is the continued COVID-19 impact on MVA operations. So as I mentioned, MVA is operating on an appointment-only basis. They closed all of their offices in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and then sort of realized that operating on an appointment-only basis was actually promoting greater efficiency. Folks were not waiting as long for their appointments, and they have decided to go ahead and move forward with that process for the foreseeable future, just because of the efficiencies that it has promoted. The agency reported that 74% of customers are experiencing a wait time under 15 minutes. The average wait time in December was just 9.7 minutes. And they have also implemented other changes, such as allowing for appointment reminders. You can check in via text message, just sitting in your car, and things like that. The last COVID-related item that I will cover is the Real ID federal requirement. So this requirement to become Real ID compliant with your identification cards was extended again. So on December 5th, the requirement from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security was extended until May 7th, 2025. Originally, the deadline was back in 2020. It was postponed numerous times. Maryland, as a state, has been Real ID compliant since calendar 2011, so over a decade. But MVA is working with individuals who are non-compliant on an individual level in terms of their documentation and identification. So to be considered Real ID compliant, there's two aspects. They have to have the new ID, which is the one with the star, and the documents on file with MVA. So MVA does track where people stand in terms of these requirements, so that when they come in to do an MVA transaction, the MVA can let them know, oh, by the way, you don't have your documents on file, and help get them into compliance. So Exhibit 9 is just a very simple visualization of those who are Real ID non-compliant by what they are missing. I did want to note that Maryland is doing very well. There are 89% of state-issued ID holders do have compliance, and that is a decrease of about a third from October 2021. And Maryland's individual compliance rate, now it is up to 91%, and that is well above the national average of 51%, so they are doing well there as well. Page 20, the recommended actions is to concur with the governor's allowance, both for the operating budget and the PAYGO capital budget. That concludes my formal presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Carrie. Any questions for the analyst? Just to explain for our millions of viewers, we have two bills that were duly referred to appropriations in another committee that are being heard right now, which is where a lot of our members are. It's not any disrespect to the Motor Vehicle Administration. I don't see any questions, so let's turn it over to Secretary Wiedefeld and Administrator Neiser.
Good afternoon, Chair Corman and members of the committee. For the record, I am Paul Wiedefeld, Acting Secretary of the Maryland Department of Transportation. I'd like to start by thanking the DLS analyst, Carrie Cook, for her review and analysis. Thank you. The MVA is dedicated to providing Marylanders with the best customer service possible, and the MVA has made tremendous strides in improving customer service, where just last week more than 92% of the customers completed their transactions within 15 minutes after their appointment time. The statewide average wait time for last week was 4.5 minutes, which is very, very good. I'm proud of the work that MVA has accomplished in 2022 and look forward to continued success this year. Now I would like to introduce you to MVA Administrator Christine Neiser, who will give a short summary of the MVA programs and will address the budget issues and recommendations.
Thank you, Secretary Wiedefeld and Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Christine Neiser, MVA Administrator, and it's my pleasure to be with you again today. I also would like to thank Carrie Cook for her analysis and thorough review. As mentioned, we completed our rollout of our new IT modernization system in December of 2021, and I really like to pause for a moment and thank the legislature for the funding. It was a significant investment that we don't always see at the Motor Vehicle Administration, and I'm really grateful for the success that's been brought forward by that investment and the confidence that you showed in how we could move forward. Since implementation, we've been able to expand the number of online and alternative services. We've been able to increase our scheduling system, and we now have 60 services that are available to customers in that one-stop shop environment. Nearly 1 million customers have their My MVA account. If you don't have yours already, I certainly want to encourage you to do so. That gives you access to anything related to MVA. So any letters we sent you, emails, status of your license, if you're Real ID compliant or not. Definitely want to encourage as many people as possible because it gives them direct access to their information. And really the fact that 3/4 of our customers are now completing their transaction outside of that traditional relationship with a customer agent at our branch offices has contributed to some of the low wait times we're also experiencing. For customers that do need to come into our branches, we're really focused on improving that customer experience, reducing wait times, and also increasing satisfaction with the services that we do provide. Our operational environment with maintaining appointments only for all transactions has enabled all of our customers really to experience that significantly reduced wait time that the Secretary just mentioned. Previously, many of you probably remember we were in an environment where we had some customers with an appointment and some customers walking in. We were up to about 30% of our customers with appointments, but it really created an environment where those who were walking in experienced a significant wait time because they were behind the customers who did have the appointments. And the fact that such a high percentage of the customers are experiencing that 15 minutes or less shows, I think, that success. I do want to assure you that customers who do show up at the branch office, our supervisors, our managers, have the authority to be able to schedule an appointment for them at that time if they have capacity, or at a later time that's convenient with them. So we want to make sure that we take care of customers even if they arrive without that appointment. The new appointment check-in process was referenced, and it's really been something that customers have taken to. 61% of our customers are now checking themselves in, so they can come and immediately wait for their number to be called. And again, they can do that from outside the branch office. But I do want to mention that our branches really offer so much more, if you haven't been in one recently, than just MBA services. We've partnered with both federal and state agencies to offer more comprehensive services in a single one-stop shop. So I'll just mention a few of them. Easy Pass transponders, MDTA, is at several of our branch offices. We're partnered with Department of Natural Resources, so you can get hunting and fishing licenses, or if you have a boat, you can get that taken care of right at MBA branch offices. If you want to get pre-checked to go through the airport, or TWIC, if you need port access, both of those are available at many branch offices, as well as veteran benefits. We partnered with Veterans Affairs. They have several locations. And most recently, and Mr. Chairman, I'm sure you'd be interested in this, we just announced Gaithersburg is now joined. We have 7 branches doing birth certificate printing, and again, that's something the legislature authorized us to do. As you think about real ID compliance, if you don't have that birth certificate, now you can get your birth certificate printed and also walk away with your driver's license doing that in 2 secure transactions. You know, I always like to say, being under transportation, customers don't care whether it's a county or state road, right? They just want that pothole or that issue resolved. And I think we look at it the same way. It's all about customer service. And so if customers can come to one place and get all those services taken care of, we certainly want to be that outlet to help them save time. So we encourage you, next time you're there, provide feedback about your visit and hopefully see that new MBA that we're trying to promote. Also wanted to mention, because this is an area where we still get a lot of questions, our new Maryland ID card number. So when we went to Customer Connect, we went away from what you probably traditionally heard of as a SoundX number. This is a unique number that is randomly generated, as opposed to the prior number, which was based on first letter of your last name and an algorithm that included your date of birth. The reason we went away from that is because, frankly, there were fraudsters who had figured out what the algorithm were, and they had ways to generate that and replicate somebody's driver's license number. And so as you're issued a new driver's license or ID card, you'll get that new number. We've gotten questions, and I wanted to make sure you were aware, because you might hear that from your constituents. Been a fair bit of conversation about MDL, and it is something that we're proud of, because we think that integrity of maintaining privacy or personal information should be something that's in the hands of the customers. We have had, we're actually close to 140,000 customers now who have an active MDL with Apple, and looking forward to expanding that with our pilot with Google. Real ID, again, we're in good stance with that, up to 91% now compared to about 51% throughout the country. In terms of CDL holders, I know it's been a topic of conversation, and so we continue to work with the trucking industry to make sure we're providing the best possible service there. Proud to report that availability of skills test appointments been reduced to 1 to 2 days. In fact, you can get same-day skills test appointments in certain branches. We're also one of the first states to implement the new CDL modernized test, which is a much more efficient test than we previously were able to provide by the federal government. We do have a departmental that I'll just mention that also, Senate Bill 705, that has several provisions to try to help our CDL drivers as well, both our new drivers as well as our existing CDL drivers. Before I wrap up, just want to mention highway safety. It's obviously a huge area of focus for us, and we are committed to the goal of 0 fatalities. We work collectively with our partners, federal, state, and local level to try to achieve that goal. I do want to remind everybody there's at zerodustmd.gov, updated monthly, a report on our fatalities. Although we don't have final numbers yet for 2022, there is a reduction at this point, and we believe that that will hold. But we continue to see the same reasons that are causing fatalities, whether it's impairment, speed, lack of wearing seatbelt, and certainly distraction. Just want to continue to encourage local jurisdictions to develop their own strategic highway safety plan, and we will work with them to do that. There is some federal funding available, as well as funding through SHA if they develop plans for specific projects. Before I conclude, I just want to say one thing about our employees. You know, everywhere I go, I tout their accomplishments because they are their accomplishments. You know, they implemented this new modernized system, which is not easy during the most, comfortable time versus the COVID period that we all struggled through as a nation and as a world. And I'm just so grateful for their continued dedication to delivering premier customer service and the great work they do every day. I'll now review the DLS recommendations and the issues that we were asked to comment on. In terms of the first issue, in terms of the salary increases, certainly establishing the prevailing wage is what we did. Maintain the same grade, but step 3, all existing employees who were below that were moved to, and all new employees were started there. Was certainly a benefit. I will say that other jurisdictions have continued to increase what they're offering from a salary perspective. Even our neighboring District of Columbia recently increased their salaries quite significantly, and so that certainly provides challenges, especially as you think of those branches that are very close to the District of Columbia. So we continue to look at where our salaries are to determine if they are at the appropriate level or if they should be further adjusted. In terms of the second issue in the vehicle emissions program, we certainly work with our partner, Maryland Department of Environment, to modernize the vehicle emissions program, but certainly do it in a way that maintains the significant desire to have good air quality progress. We're currently involved in a thorough evaluation of where the VEEP program and its state regulations should be. In order to really evaluate all of our stakeholder input, we're having conversations with members of the legislature and others to try to determine where we go moving forward. We have canceled the request for a proposal, and once we determine where we are, whether there's legislation or regulatory changes, once those are completed, then we will move forward again with our RFP for this program. Certainly want to do that as quickly as possible, but we want to make sure that we get everybody's input first. In terms of the operating and PAYGO budget recommended actions, we certainly agree. Thank you for your time. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Administrator Neiser. My Vice Chair wanted me to say something that I always say to you anyway, and said it even under the past 3 secretaries, which is we all really appreciate the constituent service that you and your team provide to us and in turn our constituents. So thank you for that. You all are very responsive. Are there any questions for the Motor Vehicle Administration? Okay, I don't see any, so thank you very much. Mr. Secretary, you're not off the hook yet, but we will turn back to Carrie Cook for the Maryland Transit Administration analysis. Carrie?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Carrie Cook, again with DLS, presenting the analysis for the Maryland Transit Administration. So you can see on page 1, the fiscal 2024 budget increases $52.8 million, or 5.3%, to $1.04 billion. I did just want to note here that in the past few years, the agency has received a substantial amount of federal funding from COVID-19 relief, revenue replacement, and stimulus funding. This funding is coming in fiscal 2024, but it will be significantly less in previous years as that COVID-19 funding sort of starts to taper down. On page 2, the PAYGO capital budget summary, fiscal 2024 decreases $25.7 million, or 3.5%, to $717.9 million. Some issues that I will be discussing later in the analysis deal with ridership recovery. Ridership for the core local bus and paratransit services are approaching pre-pandemic levels. All the ridership for other modes continues to struggle. Major transit projects, I'm going to discuss the Purple Line, as well as studies of transit options for Central Maryland. And finally, the improvement in on-time performance for mobility paratransit services. So turning now to page 5, Exhibit 1, this shows ridership by month for the different modes. So the top graph here is the total for MTA in green, and then core or local bus. The core and local bus, as it has historically, is the greatest share of all the modes in terms of ridership. So you can see here the decrease during the pandemic, and it's made a decent recovery there. And then the bottom graph shows all the other modes: light rail, metro, MARC, mobility, and commuter bus. And I did just want to draw your attention to the mobility, which is the orange line. So while that does have a lower amount of ridership, you can see that the decrease was not nearly as stark as the rest of the modes, and it is nearly back to pre-pandemic level. Mobility paratransit is a service that is required by the Americans for Disabilities Act for those with disabilities that live within a certain distance threshold to a fixed route transit station. So this service is really folks that are relying on it for their day-to-day needs versus other services that may be serving more of a commuter type population. So moving on to page 6, this is the Managing for Results, which is various statistics and performance measures for the agency. So Exhibit 2 shows the change in boardings by mode. So this is the change from the previous fiscal year. So you can see 2022 was an increase for almost all the modes, particularly for MARC, saw a pretty substantial increase from fiscal 2021. However, it still was only 25% of 2019 levels for MARC service. And Exhibit 3 on page 7 shows ridership by mode compared to 2019 in calendar 2022. So this is showing basically how close are they to being recovered to the pre-pandemic period. So you can see here that core or local bus, as I mentioned, is doing pretty well, 66% of 2019 ridership levels, mobility close to pre-pandemic levels at 86%, and the total for MTA is 57%. You can see the other services there, particularly commuter type services, metro and commuter bus, are still quite below their pre-pandemic levels. I did also want to note here that the agency has not considered scaling back their frequency of transit routes despite the continued lower amount of ridership. They note that the benefits of transit extend beyond just ridership alone in terms of economic development and environmental impacts as well. The next figure is the on-time performance, which is Exhibit 4 on page 8. So this is showing the percentage of rides that are meeting the on-time performance thresholds. So these are thresholds established by the agency. Generally, on-time performance is within 10 or so minutes of the scheduled time, but the details are in the write-up there. So you can see that in 2022, which is the light blue line, MARC was the only service that met its on-time performance goal. And the goals, as you can also see, are different for the modes. So for example, the goal for bus is at around 80%, which is quite a bit lower than the goals for the other service modes. And I'm going to be talking about on-time service a little bit in more detail later in the analysis. Exhibit 5 on page 9 shows fare box recovery. So what this is showing is the percentage of operating costs that are covered by fares by paying passengers. So as you can imagine, this ratio declined significantly during the pandemic as the operating cost did not go down because they were still running the services, but the amount of passengers did decline significantly. So 2022 in the light blue on the right side there, you can see that for MARC as well as light rail, it did go up quite a bit since fiscal 2021, but is still substantially below the 5-year average, which you can see in those black horizontal lines. On page 10, Exhibit 6, these are transit performance measures. These are standardized measures that the agency is required to report to the Federal Transit Administration. So on the left side, passengers per revenue mile. This is something that we want to be higher, the amount of passengers that you're transporting per mile that you are moving the service along. Operating cost per passenger trip, we want this number to be low, and the reason for the spike that you can see in fiscal 2021 for all three is due to, as I mentioned, there was no change in the operating costs. It cost the same amount to move the buses and the light rail along, but there was a decrease in passengers. And then finally, the operating cost per revenue mile, which is similar, the operating cost per mile that you are moving the services along. So there are some pretty substantial jumps here. I did want to highlight that the latest year that is available is fiscal 2021, not fiscal 2022. So we expect these to stabilize a little bit more once the fiscal 2022 data is available. And the final managing for results item is Exhibit 7 on page 12, which is examining the local bus system compared to peer systems. So on similar parameters that we just discussed, you can see the Baltimore system as compared to various peer systems in cities across the country. You can see that the Baltimore system does have lower operating expenses per vehicle revenue mile, which is a positive. They also have lower operating expenses per passenger trip, and the passenger trips per vehicle revenue mile is exactly the same, actually, in fiscal 2021 as the average of all the other peer systems. So while the agency did face challenges with the decreased ridership, which is, unavoidable during the pandemic, they are still doing well in compared to their peer systems. So turning now to the budget items, fiscal 2022, which is at the bottom of page 12, MTA received $527.5 million in operating relief funding to replace lost revenue and support operations generally. And an additional $106.3 million was added to the capital program for the Purple Line project from the ARPA federal program. Fiscal 2023, there was $340 in federal stimulus funds, so still a substantial amount, not quite as much as fiscal 2022. There is a proposed deficiency for fiscal 2023. That is $14.6 million for the Rapid Bus Transit Program. This is in compliance with a bill that was passed last year, Chapter 61. So this requires that anytime a deposit is made to the Maryland Stadium Facilities Fund, an amount equaling that deposit and not to exceed $27 million must be paid for bus rapid transit grants. So that is brought in to the fiscal 2023 budget via a deficiency. So now turning to the FY 2024 budget, which is what's before you. Exhibit 8 on page 14 shows the overview of agency spending, which is very comparable to previous years. You can see here that bus operations is over half of all spending and rail operations is over 1/4. Exhibit 9 on page 15 shows the differences from last year. So there is a net increase of $5.3 million in personnel expenses, mostly due to the MTA pension system as well as workers' compensation. There is an increase of almost $29 million in transit service contracts. So this is due to increased ridership as well as regular renewals of these contracts, which are expected to be valued higher at the time of renewal. And these contracts are for services that are not provided directly by MTA, but contracted. So this is mostly paratransit services as well as MARC service. There was also an anticipated about $5 million increase in efficiency and safety improvements. This is largely for continuing to roll out some real-time vehicle tracking. So doing things like updating the vehicle tracking, how many minutes till the bus shows up at the transit station and things like that. And then finally, at the top of page 16, there was an increase in grant funding for locally operated transit systems. So during the pandemic period, several of the counties were getting this type of funding from the federal government. And now that that federal funding has run out, MTA is again supporting these locally operated county transit systems. Moving on to the personnel information, which is on page 16. There is no change in their regular or contractual positions. The agency does have about 8.8% vacancies as of January. I just checked, and February 1st, they are down to 8.5%, which is about 5 to 5.5% above their budgeted turnover rate. The agency did prepare a report on hiring and retention efforts, specifically comparing the agency to other peer jurisdictions. That was a requirement in last year's Joint Chairman's report that they are required to submit. The vacancy rate in MTA is about double what it was before the pandemic, but it does remain below MDOT's vacancy as a whole for the entire agency, which is about 10.4%. And as of October 1st, which is when the report was submitted, MTA's vacancy rate was also below the average of the peer agencies that were evaluated in the report, which was about 13%. So the agency noted that there are challenges both from vacancies and also from absenteeism, current employees that are just not showing up to work. And that is a problem in operator, maintenance, and management and professional positions. MTA also noted that there was a national study, and essentially Maryland is not the only state that is experiencing workforce challenges in their transit sector. 96% of agencies nationally that responded to this poll said that they were experiencing workforce shortages, and 84% said that those challenges were affecting their ability to provide transit service. So this is not a Maryland unique program. The agency notes that their vacancies are particularly high in frontline positions, particularly extremely specialized positions, such as maintenance workers or light rail maintenance, where there's very, very specific skills that you need to be successful there. One other thing that I wanted to highlight from the report is that the agency compared salary rates for positions versus other peer agencies, about 25 positions. MTA salaries were lower than the peer agencies for almost every position that they analyzed in that report. You can't always make a direct comparison because position titles and other things may not be directly comparable, but for the ones that they analyzed, MTA's salaries were generally lower, and they were sometimes lower by 30% or more than the other comparable peer agencies that they analyzed. So that's definitely something to think about. The agency also highlighted efforts they are making to reduce the vacancy rate, including partnership with trade schools, apprenticeship programs, and hiring a DEIJ officer, as well as partnering with the Baltimore City Mayor's office. So the agency should comment on its efforts to supplement salaries and wages to make the agency more competitive with peer transit agencies. They should also be prepared to discuss how absenteeism affects transit service and details of the recently implemented Leave and Absent Management Directive. Turning now to the PAYGO Capital Program, which begins on page 18. So the 6-year Consolidated Transportation Program for MTA totaled $4.4 billion. This is an increase of $184.7 million from the previous year's program, and you can see that breakout in Exhibit 10. On page 19, I did just want to mention the IIJA. So this is both the current federal authorization for federal formula funding for transportation projects, as well as it includes competitive grant discretionary projects. So the MTA has been active in applying for these grants and these discretionary projects, primarily through the RAISE program, as well as the Low and No Emissions Vehicle program. So the agency has programmed $236 million in IIJA funding that they anticipate receiving over the 6-year program, and about $26 million of that is planned in the fiscal 2024 allowance. And all those details are listed in the appendix. Exhibit 11 on page 19 shows the projects that are funded in fiscal 2024 in the capital program. And that is a long exhibit. And then Exhibit 12 on page 22 is showing you the cash flow changes. So what this is showing you here is fiscal 2023 as introduced versus fiscal 2023 where we are now in terms of the capital spending, and then the 2024 allowance. So you can see a reduction here in the federal funding, which is in green, from 2023 working to 2024 allowance. That is mostly due to federal funds for the purple line. The last of those federal funds were applied to fiscal 2023, as well as the completion of a major MARC project, which was 80% federally funded. So To balance the program, as many of the MDOT TBUs do, they increased the special funding since the federal funding was projected to decrease. The next few exhibits show some continued cash flow changes. So Exhibit 13 is showing the introduced compared to the working appropriation. So these are just changes that occur from year to year due to procurement schedules, weather conditions, permitting, and just other logistical considerations that may sort of accelerate or decelerate certain projects based on the initial plan from the past year. Exhibit 14 shows capital cash flow changes from the working appropriation of fiscal 2023 to the 2024 allowance. And on page 26, this is a new requirement that requires MDOT to include projects that are receiving funding for the first time, either first-year design funding or first-year construction funding, and to highlight those. So Exhibit 15 on page 27 shows that 89.1 million, or 12% of the fiscal 2024 funding, does meet that criteria as first-year funding. And then the list of those projects receiving first-year funding is in Exhibit 16. So that includes projects receiving first-year funding in fiscal 2024 or projects that receive first-year funding in fiscal 2023 that was not reported last year. And then the last item for their capital is on Exhibit 17 on page 30, which shows the significant changes from last year's CTP plan. And that just includes some projects that were added to the program appearing in the capital plan for the first time. Turning now to the issues section of the analysis. So the first issue is regarding several major transit projects. First, I'm going to discuss the Purple Line. So the Purple Line is a 16.2 mile light rail line that will extend from Bethesda to New Carrollton. In January 2022, the Board of Public Works approved a contract for a new contractor and amendments to the P3 agreement. So this was after the previous contractor left the project and BPW approved a settlement in December 2020 to settle with the original contractor. So Purple Line Transit Partners oversaw the procurement process for the replacement contractor. The revised total agreement amounted to $9.3 billion, which did include the settlement payment to the original contractor. As of the December 20th, 2022 report, the overall project is 49% complete. You can see the breakdown of the completion of the project components listed on page 31. The initial start for revenue service was in March 2022. That was before the departure of the original contractor. Revenue service is now expected to begin in fall 2026. Moving on to page 32. So there is a potential additional delay with the project, and that relates to an issue regarding relocating utilities. So in November 2022, a technical advisor identified some challenges that could potentially cause another delay to the project up to 7 months. As of the writing of this analysis, there has been no official change to the availability date for service. The parties have not yet agreed upon and implemented a revised path forward. So there has been no revised timeline yet established. As of my conversations with the agency, the partners are still discussing the challenges, how to avoid another delay if possible. So at the moment, there has been no official change in the timeline or the schedule, but it is an issue that they are trying to mitigate at this time. I also wanted to touch on some transit opportunities for Central Maryland. So in December, Governor Moore publicly announced his intention to resurrect the Red Line Transit Project. This was a project that was going to provide east-west transit service in Baltimore City. There was funding that was secured from the federal government. In 2015, former Governor Hogan canceled the project, returned over $900 million in federal funding, and redirected state funds to other projects. So there has been no official announcement from MTA regarding resurrecting this project. However, there is a potential opportunity through a regional transit plan that has been ongoing. So this plan was originally published in October 2020, and it lays out a long-term plan for transit opportunities. It has a very thorough summary of needs, goals, milestones for transit in Central Maryland. And the plan also includes 2 studies to examine transit opportunities in Baltimore. So a north-south corridor and an east-west corridor. North-south would be Towson to downtown, and then east-west would be Hopkins Bayview to Ellicott City. So these transit studies are ongoing. There is $22.9 million programmed in the and the CTP for both of these studies. That funding is planned until fiscal 2027. So in terms of the east-west corridor, which would be the one that could potentially serve similar populations that the Red Line would have served had it been completed. So the next step for this project is the alternatives analysis phase. So right now there is a corridor that is selected. The agency is going to review it and then come back, present options for alignment, transit modes, and specific station locations for public engagement and feedback. So this process is going to begin this spring or summer, and this process of engaging the public with these different options, they estimate it will take 1 to 2 years to complete, and it will result in the selection of one preferred alternative. The north-south corridor study is also ongoing. It's not quite as far along as the process as the east-west corridor study is. I also just wanted to note here that there has been development in Baltimore City and surrounding areas since the Red Line was canceled, so it will not be possible to bring back the alignment as it was initially planned. Governor Moore also set aside an additional $500 million in the fiscal 2024 budget to support strategic transportation priorities across the state. This funding has not been earmarked for one specific project. The agency notes it could support various transportation needs, including transit in Baltimore City, or perhaps congestion relief in PG and Montgomery County, or MARC projects. So given all that, the agency should comment on efforts to keep the Purple Line project on schedule and maintain transparency if additional delays arise. MTA should also be prepared to discuss how community engagement will be prioritized as the regional transit plan for Central Maryland continues to move forward. There is also going to be a recommended action on the Purple Line, which I will revisit in just a moment. The second issue is a follow-up on mobility paratransit on-time performance. So this was an issue that was covered extensively in last year's analysis, and it resulted from very poor performance of on-time service for mobility paratransit. So as I mentioned earlier, mobility paratransit is provided by MTA per requirement in the Americans with Disabilities Act for folks who live within a certain geographic area of a fixed route transit station. These folks can reserve a ride, and then the ride will come to them. So the goal for on-time service for mobility paratransit is 92%. That's established by the agency. And the ride is considered on time if it arrives within 30 minutes of the scheduled pickup time. So that's a pretty wide window in terms of being considered on time. So the agency did struggle in providing this service on time for our folks with disabilities in calendar 2021. You can see on Exhibit 19, shows you by month on-time performance. So you can see particularly through summer and fall 2021 there, they really struggled. The low was in September with just 59% of rides being on time. And again, that's a pretty wide on-time threshold there. But you can see beginning in March particularly, there was an upward trend, and now for the past several months, they have been on track and continuing that on-time performance. So there was language restricted in the fiscal 2023 budget pending a report on delayed paratransit services. If no further action is requested by the committee, DLS recommends $100,000 in withheld special funds be released. So I'm just going to go over a little bit of additional information on what that report covered. So the agency notes that during the pandemic, the demand for these paratransit services declined, and there were existing labor challenges, and many operators simply sought additional employment, left the agency. And so when the demand picked back up, they really struggled because they had a severe shortage of operators. So to try and address this issue, MTA issued emergency contracts to supplement their operators. In terms of long-term strategies, they also pursued some hiring and recruitment bonuses and pushing for wage increases to try and get some more full-time operators back. I did want to highlight in April 2022, MTA awarded some new service contracts, and they included an increase in minimum wage for the operators, which the agency notes has resulted in increased applications and resulting reduction in vacancies. The current average starting pay for a mobility driver is $20 to $21 per hour. It is much higher than it was before. It was $18 in 2021 and $15 or less before that. So as you recall from the beginning of the presentation, the ridership demand for mobility service is really pretty much back to pre-pandemic levels. So it is important that they recruit and maintain those operators. The agency is also undergoing efforts to improve real-time tracking of vehicles so that customers know exactly when their ride is arriving. So this month, they launched a new trip reservation system and website along with a corresponding phone application so that folks can book their trips on their phone and also see exactly where the vehicle is. The report also required the agency to describe how to mitigate delayed service, as well as specific reporting requirements on how much the service was delayed. So there is something called the Mobility Operations Control Center, which monitors all the trips and runs a late line where customers can call if they're experiencing a delay. They do dispatch on-call drivers to restore service if there's something like an accident or a mechanical failure, but during peak times, all the drivers are already out there. So that's another sort of personnel challenge. Exhibit 19 shows the delayed trips sort of by the severity here. So this is for fiscal 2022, and you can see the yellow bars are trips that were late by 1 to 30 minutes, 17% over this period. And then the red bars are trips that were late by between 30 minutes and 1 hour. And that was 4% over this period. So, and you can see as the red bars are decreasing, fewer and fewer of the trips were substantially late. Only 2.6% of trips were delayed by 1 hour or more during this period. And finally, to promote efficiency generally, MTA is working with a consultant to test recommended changes to their routing and scheduling algorithms and software programs to try and continue to promote that efficiency. And DLS recommends that MTA comment on the on-time threshold, which again is 30 minutes within the scheduled pickup time, so on either side 30 minutes. Comment on the on-time threshold for mobility paratransit in relation to other modes, and if performance improvements in on-time performance may lead to a change in these benchmarks. The recommended actions for MTA on page 37 for the operating budget is to restrict the appropriation dependent on bi-monthly reports on the Purple Line project, similar to the restriction last year. And then the PAYGO recommended action is to concur with the governor's allowance. That concludes my formal presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Carrie. Any questions for the analyst? Okay, we'll now turn to Secretary Wiedefeld and Administrator Arnold. Thanks for being here.
Good afternoon again, Chair Corman and members of the committee. For the record, I'm Paul Wiedefeld, Acting Secretary of the Maryland Department of Transportation. And again, I would like to thank our analyst, Carrie Cook, for her thorough review of MTA's budget and professionalism throughout the process. Over the past year, MTA has continued to recover ridership on all of their modes. This is the trend that we expect to continue at this as this administration prioritizes key investments in maintaining and growing our transit systems. The state is fully committed to delivering on the promises of a safe, efficient, equitable transit system for all Maryland citizens and all riders who rely on it to access to school, work, and all life's opportunities. Transit's benefits are numerous, and continued investment in our system are critical to ensuring strong economic growth within the state. Under my direction, MTA will be focused on increasing the reliability of the existing transportation system and moving forward with investments that will allow the network to grow. I'm now pleased to introduce Holly Arnold, Administrator of the Maryland Transit Administration. Holly has been with MTA for over 10 years and with the past year and a half as the Administrator. Holly?
Thank you, Secretary Wiedefeld. Good afternoon, Chair Corman and members of the committee. For the record, I'm Holly Arnold, the Administrator of the Maryland Transit Administration. I would also like to thank our analyst, Carrie Cook, for her thoughtful questions and partnership. As Administrator of MTA and a daily rider of our service, I'm fully committed to delivering a safe, frequent, reliable, and easy-to-use transit system. In 2022, we advanced projects that will mean better service and more options for our riders. We were awarded several significant competitive grants, including $6 million in raised funding for the Baltimore Penn Station Connections Project and over $7 million as part of the All Stations Accessibility Program for the renovation of our Martin State Airport Station. We also partnered with Amtrak for the Susquehanna Bridge project and won $20 million to complete the final design for that. And we completed a major project with the opening of our Mark Riverside facility. This is a $64 million investment, which will allow us to improve our equipment and maintenance repair times and lead to increased fleet availability and improved on-time performance for our riders. And we launched a campaign against sexual harassment on our system to ensure that everyone feels safe while riding. We're focused on efforts that will make a difference to our riders, and we're going to continue to focus on that. So given that, I'd like to talk a little bit about what we're doing to make our system more reliable. So as Carrie noted, transit agencies across the country have been impacted by a workforce shortage, and MTA is no different. The challenges that we've faced in hiring staff have impacted our overall service reliability and is a key factor in our ability to consistently deliver on the scheduled service. So the MTA team has prioritized its hiring and retention efforts to address these challenges. This includes new collective bargaining agreements with 2 of our unions that include significant pay increases and new benefits, reviewing our internal standards for hiring candidates, including the evaluation of years of experience and background check requirements, new social media campaigns and videos highlighting all the reasons that MTA is a great place to work. And we launched an updated webpage with key information about the benefits for working with MTA, and we'll be continuing to expand on those efforts this coming year. And so these are important because we are seeing our ridership continuing to grow following the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2022, our ridership grew by 18% over the prior year. And last year, we did see all of our service modes hit post-COVID ridership highs, and we expect that to continue this year. So we haven't yet returned to those pre-COVID ridership levels, but we're on our way, and we need to be ready for those riders and to support our growing region. And I do want to note that, ridership in and of itself doesn't tell the full story of the importance of transit to the region. There are countless benefits when it comes to transit. More and better transit means economic mobility for individuals who don't have access to a car or can't drive, fewer single occupancy vehicles on the road, which decreases emissions and roadway congestion, and increased development in the communities that it serves. It is a critical part of our region in achieving the goals of our region, and a great region needs great transit. So on that note, while we're focused on increasing the reliability of our services in the immediate future, we're also working hard on planning longer term to expand the services through new projects and initiatives. So this includes moving forward on both the east-west and the north-south corridor studies in Baltimore as part of the Regional Transit Plan, advancing the Southern Maryland Rapid Transit Project study, which can help to provide transit access to the fastest growing region in Maryland, converting our fleet of buses to zero-emission vehicles, including new coaches, maintenance facilities, and charging infrastructure with our pilot program beginning later this year, and executing a memorandum of understanding with Amtrak to build the new Frederick Douglass Tunnel, which opens up the possibility of 30-minute MARC service between Baltimore and DC, and constructing that new ADA accessible West Baltimore MARC station that we've needed for a long time. In fact, you may have seen we had a recent visit with President Biden to tout the importance of that project, and are moving it forward with Amtrak. Obviously, I can't talk about expansion without mentioning the Purple Line. So construction of this 16-mile light rail project is well underway. The team is hard at work to deliver a project that serves the needs of the region, and we're going to continue focusing on that. So needless to say, there's a lot going on at MTA, and it's clear that the future of transit in Maryland is very bright. I would like to take a moment to respond to the items raised in the budget analysis. So first, they asked MTA commenting on the efforts to supplement salaries and wages to make our agency more competitive, and talking about the new leave and absence management directive. So I'm going to break those up a little bit. So first, regarding wages, we did enter into new collective bargaining agreements with our Local 1300 and Local 2 unions. They guarantee increased wages for operators, mechanics, and union office workers over the next 4 years. And so we think that's going to go a long way towards making our agency more competitive in this tight labor market. Regarding absenteeism, so what does absenteeism mean on a daily basis? That, along with the hiring challenge, impacts our service reliability. Essentially, we need people available to provide our service, to maintain our buses, to answer phones, all of those things. And so if we have fewer people available to work, it results in more cut trips, which does impact our reliability. So we launched a new leave and absence management directive that includes updated and clearer guidance for our employees about their available leave and how they can utilize it in a way that allows us to meet the needs of our riders. We've launched new technology that helps us to better track it. We're hiring case managers to monitor usage and provide counseling to employees. So we want to make sure that we're being compassionate about this. If folks need additional help, our case managers are there to help them understand the benefits that they do have and can utilize. And so while it is still very early, we launched this in mid-January, we are seeing improvements in reliability as a result of this. You know, our cut service has gone down over the past few weeks. Next, you wanted me to comment on the purple line, keeping it on schedule and maintaining transparency. So regarding the timeline, as was noted, we are still working on negotiations with our private partners at PLTP. We haven't agreed to an updated schedule. We have acknowledged that there is going to be some delay, and we're working as much as possible to mitigate that delay, and the team is working very closely together. Our updated reports, the requests, the JCR reports, will include updated information that are better sharing tracking our progress and how we're moving forward on that. And so you'll see the next one of those coming out March 1st. So I don't want to get into too many details because we are still in negotiations, but I'm happy to provide that updated information as soon as we have that agreement. And regarding the regional transit plan, community engagement. So community engagement is a critical component to anything that we do at MTA. We do a ton of rider outreach. And so we've done that on these corridor projects, pretty extensive outreach, both in person and virtually. We're doing a lot of pop-ups at bus stops and on buses themselves so that we can make sure we're hearing from the riders and those in the corridor. We're going to continue these efforts as projects from the regional transit plan moves forward. And then finally, it was noted to comment on changing the on-time performance threshold for our mobility paratransit system. So there we do follow industry standard, and so industry standard for paratransit is pretty typical for that 30-minute window. But we are continuing to explore options to improve service to our mobility paratransit riders. You know, I will note our on-time performance is now regularly above 95%. Some days we've been hitting 97, 98% on time. We did a new run cut recently that allowed us to have more efficiencies and improve the time that people are spending on the vehicles. So that's our big focus now, is how can we shorten those trips and make the experience more comfortable for our riders. And we did launch our first mobility app, so folks can see when their bus is going to come in real time. And I can say, as a rider, that is critical. So you can make those decisions. You know, am I waiting outside, inside? And it makes a huge difference. And then last, I will say, we concur with the recommended actions from the DLS analyst. And so with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, Madam Administrator. You called yourself a daily rider. I think anybody who follows you on Twitter knows you ride it way more than once a day. And we don't know how you got here today. That's the big mystery, because I don't think there's a Baltimore to Annapolis. Is there a commuter bus you could take?
There's a commuter bus and the local Link 70 I can take.
Fantastic. I knew you were the person to ask. Any questions for the department? Delegate Edelson.
Hi to both of you. Great to see you. Just a few questions. One, in terms of ridership, I'm curious if there are any other kinds of creative outside-the-box incentives we can try. I know we recently tried the free fare day. Do we have any numbers on how that looked, and if that's something we could try to do again, just to try to bring more people into the tent of ridership?
Yeah, so the Fare Free Day, we got a lot of really positive feedback from it. I know our riders liked it, appreciated it. Our operators, I think, enjoyed that they got to just go faster. They didn't have to worry about collecting fares, which is always easier. Unfortunately, the day that we did it was the coldest day of the year, I think, and so a lot of folks stayed inside. So we were hoping to see that ridership bump.
And a Saturday as well.
Yeah, it was
a Saturday.
We were hoping to see that ridership bump, but didn't. But we're going to continue to explore other options and how we can bring more riders back. We did launch recently the Charm Flex. So as part of our Charm Pass on your phone, you can buy a 3 and a 10-day pass, trying to recognize the different travel patterns that people now have. So they may just, if you have the pass, it makes it easier to jump on and jump off.
Got it. All for trying Fare Free Day again. And then just in terms of the on-time performance metrics, I think, anecdotally, for so many people, their experience with the system is going to be positive or negative based on was it on time or not. We see the bus numbers increasing, but still below the 80% threshold. Light rail went down, mobility went down a little bit. Just wanted to get a little bit more context on your thoughts there of how we can get those numbers up.
So it really does go back to the reliability and having enough operators. So cut service actually has a huge impact on our on-time performance. So if for whatever reason we don't have an operator that's available to run that service, that bus doesn't show up, but it also has an impact on the bus that follows it, right? Because all those riders that would have been on the prior bus are now getting on this one. So it takes longer to load, it takes longer to unload. It has a pretty big impact across the system. So our focus really is on the reliability, making sure we have enough operators, making sure that our schedule reflects that. And we're going to continue to focus on that. We have bi-weekly meetings where we sit down with our entire bus team, we do it on the rail modes as well, and take a look at on-time performance, take a look at the routes, how they're performing, how we can change them on the next schedule to better align with the current run times. And so it is a continual process, and we're very focused on it.
Go ahead.
Other questions? Okay, I do have a few. The analysis, and I actually think you noted that you've launched a new trip reservation system and mobile app for real-time trip information. For the analysis is focused on mobility, although you made it sound broader than that. So it just launched in February 2023, so probably not a lot of data yet. But we usually hear a lot of complaints about mobility. As you know, the first hearing I convened as chair of the subcommittee was about mobility issues. So what's the initial sort of feedback and view on that on the mobility space?
It's been very positive. And I will note that we have a really great partnership with Disability Rights Maryland and have we did a beta testing with their members before we launched. So we wanted to make sure that we were having actual users test it out. And so they helped us to work out some of the kinks. We actually did delay the launch a little bit because we wanted to make sure we were being responsive to what the riders were looking for. But initially, it's been very positive. People like that they can just go on their phone and book it. They're able to see where their vehicle is. They don't have to necessarily call the call center, and so it's been really fantastic so far.
Great. And then I just wanted to go through what I consider a few of your kind of major ongoing projects to understand what's sort of the next sort of tranche of work that needs to be done with them. My colleague Delegate Solomon isn't here, so in his stead, I'll ask about the Brunswick line work.
So we put out a Brunswick line feasibility study for comment. I'm going to get the date wrong, but within the past couple of months, and we are gearing up for a public meeting on that within the next few weeks. If I haven't sent you that information, I'll make sure that you all receive it. Again, we're requesting comments now on what folks are looking for from the Brunswick line service. There's a number of different scenarios that we've put out there. Is it more midday service that we need? Is it more peak hour? Is it more weekend? Like, what are we actually looking for and want to accomplish? And then based on that, we'll take a look at the infrastructure needs associated with each of those different scenarios. That study also does include some expansions into Western Maryland as required per legislation. And so there are 4 different options within that study. And again, we want to get feedback from folks in terms of like what is the best for the region to serve that area.
So beyond that sort of public comment period, which you have at least sent to me, so thank you. Is it more planning? Is it, I'm sure it's not construction, is it environmental? Is it design? Like, what would be the sort of the next thing? I know the specifics depends on what the feedback is, but if you're going to do something, what would sort of be past the public comment, what would need to be done sort of next?
So it's a combination of modeling from CSX. So CSX owns the Brunswick line, we do not. And so we've done our own modeling and we know what we think, but obviously CSX wants to do theirs. So we'll be working with them on that modeling. At the same time, we want to advance as much design as possible towards these projects, but we don't want to go too far ahead if CSX, comes back with something different. So it's going to be a combination of that over the next year.
And equipment.
Sorry, Mr. Secretary.
And equipment, obviously, if it's more service, where will we get the trains and the coaches?
Okay. And then the Southern Maryland Rapid Transit?
So the next steps there are an MOU with Prince George's and Charles counties to just determine how we're going to move this project forward. It's actually with the counties right now for signature, so as soon as they're ready to sign, we'll advance that. And then it is moving into the NEPA process. So the goal here is getting a ROD within the next couple of years on that project. We have $10 million in the budget, which is enough to get us going on that, and we'll be working with the counties over the next year.
Okay. And then, stealing my colleague's thunder, I guess, I don't know how you want to describe it, if it's the east-west or the red line, I don't know how you want to describe it. What's sort of the next, I'm not asking for the final outcome, but what's kind of the next step here that we're looking for in the next few months?
So it's continued stakeholder outreach. So we did a lot of public outreach last year and got some good feedback. Right now, it's really the jurisdictions. So we want to work with the institutions, with the elected officials, the county executive, the mayor, just to make sure that as a region, we all are on the same page with how we want to move this forward. So we anticipate that'll be the next couple of months, and then we'll make a decision from there.
Okay, and the red line, quite famously had sort of final environmental documentation, I guess 8-9 years ago. So is more work, would more work need, in any scenario, would more work need to be done on that, or what's the?
Yes. So the document, the environmental document is more than 5 years old, which does require at minimum either a reevaluation or a supplemental. We've had initial conversations with FTA, and we're working with them now to determine of all the work that was done, what can be reused, because we do believe a lot of it can be. There have been some changes in the corridor, but not everywhere, and so we want to make the argument, hey, we can use a lot of this, but also identify the areas where we need to redo it. But I do know we don't have a ROD at the moment, and so we will have to do that again.
Great, thank you. I'm actually not going to ask about the Purple Line, although I just want to note that the Purple Line Transit Partners this year, they're going to be coming up after you, so I will have some questions for them, and feel free if you want to come back up at any point or chime in or however you want to do it, if they're more appropriate for MTA. I have to admit, it's a little hard for me to tell what's an MTA issue versus a PLTP issue, but let me start with PLTP on those if that's all right, and then we can always bring you back in.
Sounds good. And I will note, we're joined at the hip with PLTP. Like we are really great partners, and so maybe that's a good thing that you can't tell because we are working so closely together.
Yeah, Madam Vice Chair.
I never know whether I'm supposed to push the button or not push the button. Old committee had different rules. That's all I'm saying. The grant funding has increased quite a bit for locally operated transit systems, and our analysts said that part of that was sort of replacing federal funding during COVID. Mm-hmm. So is this number then that it has increased by almost, 9,722,000, is that a number that's going to be sustained at that level in future years, or is that more similar to before we had the federal funding?
So that number is still lower than what we had previously. Okay. So during COVID, we did make a number of cuts across our program, including a reduction to about 20% to the locally operated transit program. It was offset by federal funds, more than offset by federal funds. And so as each of the lots has been spending down their federal funds, we're replacing those with state funds.
So you expect this number to increase in future years?
Continue to increase, yeah. So the Montgomery and Prince George's counties have spent all of their federal relief funds. Some of the other counties still have some going out. Some of the rural counties received amounts of funding that it's like more than their operating budget, like several years worth of an operating budget. And so we anticipate, I think we're tracking it out into like 27, 28, that they'll still be spending down that funding.
Okay, and is this competitive grant funding?
No, it's been, so this is one area we're looking at a formula on how to better do this. Our state funding has been flat for a number of years. There's no one at the agency who knows why it was based on what it was, and so we are looking at how it should be done, and so that's going to be an ongoing conversation we have with the lots over the next year to make sure that we actually have a formula that people can understand why they're getting the amount of money that they are, and it's not based on something that no one can understand.
Okay, good. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
It's not a departmental bill, but I think there is a bill on that topic as well that you'll probably take a look at. Any further? Delegate Edelson, second bite at the apple.
Sorry, I tried to not, but I just can't help myself on the east-west. Just a question on that corridor, which is my understanding correct that depending on the ultimate alignment would impact just how much of the environmental studies we'd have to redo, right? Mm-hmm. So if the alignment remained as much as possible similar to what it originally did, then that would mean that the amount of rework that would have to be done would be less. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Great. I don't see any further questions for the department or the administration, so thank you both very much. I'll now call up Doran Basso, President and CEO of Purple Line Transit Partners. Do you want to stay? Yeah, that's great. You joined at the hip. And Mr. Basso, I don't know if you had any prepared remarks or you're just here to take questions or.
I did not. Good afternoon, Chair Corman and Vice Chair Watson, and thank you for the opportunity. Pleased to be here to support our partner, MTA, and demonstrate our commitment to the Purple Line and the communities we serve.
Great. Really appreciate you being here. I'll just say that if we're going to do these public-private partnerships, I think it's important that the private partner be at the table, not only with the department joined at the hip, but also subject to the legislative oversight that comes with a project of this size. I don't know if any of my other colleagues have questions, but I do have a few. And frankly, I'm mostly a pass-through here with questions from many of my colleagues who you know and have spoken to the east of where my legislative district is. The first question is, what's sort of the status of the Talbot Avenue Bridge replacement, do you know?
Sure. We are Working hard on Talbot Avenue Bridge currently. There's actually concrete pours scheduled next month. So we're advancing that work. We don't have a firm deadline. It's contingent on some things we're working through now with local stakeholders and access. But that work is progressing, and we're looking to have it open just as soon as we possibly can. We're talking, months, not years, but I can't give you a firm deadline.
Yeah, even the months, not years is helpful. As you know, one of the major complaints we get is about some of the roads where the construction is being done and the heavy construction equipment going on roads. Luckily, we've had not a bad winter, but plenty of potholes, plenty of damage, and a lot of concerns that it's not being patched up in a timely fashion. Do you have any sort of update on that I can provide to my colleagues?
Sure. We're in the middle of our community advisory team meetings right now, where twice a year we go through 7 communities. So the whole month of February, every Tuesday, Thursday, we're speaking with a different kind of local community along the alignment. We take that feedback all the time, but particularly at those meetings. So we have heard the community. We believe there are some things that need addressed. So potholing you can do or repairing potholes you can do during the winter. A major repaving schedule, we're kind of in discussions with MTA now, and also it can't really be done in the winter months, right? So we are looking at what we should do in the spring in terms of the conditions of the road, which of course we take very seriously.
Great. And sorry, were those meetings you were just describing, those are the same CAT meetings that like MTA posts on its website that
Yes.
were rescheduled from, I guess, the end of last year to the beginning of this year?
Correct.
Okay. And did I hear you say those are going to be twice a year?
Typically, that's what the cadence we've been on.
So the intention is for those to be twice a year. So
Yes.
there'd be another round of meetings in calendar year 2023 is your
That's
intention.
the intent. Yep.
Okay, great. And then, again, I know you've heard this before, but not in this setting, pedestrian safety issues around a lot of the work, including, sidewalks being closed, on both sides at the same time without a lot of sort of attention to how humans are supposed to get through there who aren't in their cars. Any thoughts on how that work is going, in particular, how to make sure subcontractors are meeting your standards, which I think are pretty high?
Absolutely. We hear a lot from stakeholders on that, and it is a focus of the team. I mean, we do things such as having flaggers for bus pickup and drop off at certain elementary schools or any school really close. We're on the University of Maryland campus. I mean, tremendous amount of pedestrians you go through during class change. They pretty much have the right of way. So along the alignment, we have a good feeling of the sensitive issues, and I believe we keep our finger on the pulse and make it a priority to keep it safe for pedestrians.
And another one that I know isn't new is Jones Bridge and Jones Mill Road. That intersection, there's been a lot of work going on there, but it sounds pretty hazardous for cars to even know where they're supposed to be going. Do you have any kind of update on that?
I do not have an update on that specifically. I know the team is focused with advancing that Jones Mill area, but I don't have those details with me on the next phase.
Great. And as I continue to carry Delegate Solomon's water up here, as you know, one of your predecessors, although I might have that a little confused, told the legislature, or at least told individual legislators, that the trail could reopen before revenue service began on the Purple Line. And I know there's been some sort of shift in that view over time, so I just wanted to see if there had been maybe any further shifts in that view since the last time we spoke.
Sure. I don't think you're going to see another shift in that view in the next few years. We understand the importance of the trail. I myself am an avid cyclist, and I know how important it is for that community, and they live there and use that trail to get to school and the shops and live their lives. And we want to restore it as soon as it is safe to do so. And so we'll be constantly evaluating as we go through construction when the soonest we can open that trail is. But at this time, we can't commit to before revenue service.
Any other questions for PLCP? Okay. Well, thank you for being here and being joined at the hip with our state partners.
Absolutely.
Colleagues, we do have another witness who signed up. I'm not sure if they're here. Anna Ellis. Oh, thanks for your patience. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Anna Ellis. I've been riding the Baltimore transit system for my entire life. And I'm retired now, but I still use the transit system several times a week. The reason I'm here today is to make the case for improved funding for MTA. We constantly hear of operator shortages, which are causing service to be reduced from what is scheduled. These scheduled runs, which do not occur, are not announced in any way and are often not reflected on the transit app, so a rider must just wait and wait for the bus to show up. And while the shortage of operators is not unique to MTA, other transit systems have used financial incentives to hire and retain more operators. New York City and New Jersey Transit offered incentives to retired workers and to new hires. And while New Jersey Transit had an on-time performance of 95.4% in January 23, MTA's on-time performance was 72.5% in December, and that percentage does not include the scheduled runs which don't happen. The fall schedule changes were supposed to include restoration of the quick bus on an east-west route, but that was cut due to operator shortages, which is my understanding. Light rail service has improved since last spring when the service was abysmal, but the light rail is still operating on a reduced Saturday schedule, and the expanded Sunday service, which was part of Baltimore Link, has never been implemented. To have a reliable transit system, light rail, metro, subway, and buses must operate according to the published schedules at a minimum. In order for that to happen, it is clear that additional funding is required to hire more operators and supervisors. Thank you for letting me express my observations.
Thank you so much for testifying. Any questions for Ms. Ellis? Okay, thank you for your testimony. That concludes the budget hearing on the Maryland Transit Administration and the budget hearings for today. Thank you all for hanging in there. Have a great afternoon.